If you look at the average history textbook, the end of World War I isn't really covered all that much. It's usually boiled down to a catchy phrase. On the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the war to end all wars was over. Of course, the reality of the situation wasn't nearly as neat and orderly as that saying would have you believe. After all, organizing a global ceasefire is rather a complex affair, especially when you don't have the luxury of instant communication. That's why the armistice went into effect a full 5 hours after it had been signed. Now, you'd imagine that during those crucial 5 hours, most soldiers would be hunkering down and nervously counting down the minutes. And that is indeed what some were doing. However, not everyone was just waiting around passively. In fact, these final hours of the First World War saw a flurry of action across all fronts, sometimes continuing to the very last minute. To understand why, it's worth pointing out that an armistice isn't a peace treaty, so it doesn't technically end a war. Many on the side of the Allies were worried that Germany would use the ceasefire as a stalling tactic. What they didn't know was that in early November 1918, Germany wasn't even remotely entertaining such a notion, for it was on the brink of collapse. After years of blockades and shortages, the German military was a shattered force. Soldiers and sailors openly disobeyed their orders to attack. Some deserted, while others banded together and instigated revolution. Inspired by the success of the Bolsheviks in Russia, these revolutionaries created soldier councils across Germany in an attempt to create their own Soviet republics. Now, of course, the Allies weren't aware of this, so to ensure against bad faith negotiations, many commanders pushed on with their plans even after learning of the impending ceasefire. The commander of the American forces on the Western Front did exactly that. In a letter to the Allied War Council, he advised against an armistice, arguing that only an unconditional surrender would be enough to prevent Germany from ever rising up again. His warnings were ignored, and we all know how that turned out. Yet, nevertheless, he pushed to gain as much ground as possible in the final hours of the war. Unsurprisingly, this resulted in the last casualty of the war being an American, as the 313th Infantry Regiment assaulted a small village in Lorraine. Some soldiers took this fight-to-the-last-minute order more seriously than others. A certain Henry Gunther, who had recently been demoted from sergeant to private, tried to prove his valiance by charging a German machine gun position by himself. The German soldiers on the other side tried to shoo him away, but when he didn't relent, they shot him, exactly 1 minute before the armistice was to take effect, at 10:59 a.m. Of course, this incident was far from isolated. In fact, the final day of the war saw over 10,000 casualties. And it wasn't just the Americans attacking either. The 231st Brigade from Britain, for example, was planning to assault a vital bridge along the Dendre River when they learned of the impending armistice. They then received new orders. They had an hour and a half to capture the bridge. They were successful, but most likely because their opponents didn't really put up a fight. Understandably. The situation on the Austro-Italian front was a similar story. Their armistice had been signed on November 3rd, with a full 24-hour forewarning, leaving the Italians plenty of time to push into enemy territory. Now, it's worth noting that although these advances weren't made with the intent of killing enemy combatants, they still saw plenty of ammunition being fired. We know from the memoirs of numerous artillerymen that they were encouraged to fire their shells liberally, with the end result being that they wouldn't have to haul them all the way back home. Thus, the final hours of World War I were full of a lot of fake fights, and some real ones, during which Henry Gunther and 2,000 other men lost their lives. It was all rather pointless at the end of the day, but on the bright side, at least Private Gunther was re-promoted to sergeant posthumously, for all that's worth. Well, my dear friends, don't go to war. Don't start a war. spread peace and love and harmony and all that. While this was a gloomy adventure, I hope you nevertheless enjoyed learning about it. If you did, I'd appreciate it if you'd share it around with your friends and gave it a like, or dare I say it, if you became a patron on Patreon. Ah, yes, we would love you forever. In any case, we shall meet again in another 2 weeks for the next cynically instructive episode of SideQuest.